Okay, yeah, my name's Malcolm. I work with the Venceremos Brigade. I just came back from Cuba a few months ago for the 6th time. And I'm going to talk about the 5, really, more than anything. So tomorrow is September 12th. It's going to mark 16 years since the Cuban 5 were arrested. That's Fernando, Rene, Ramon, Antonio, and Gerardo, who were arrested on September 12th, 1998, after several years infiltrating violent anti-Cuban groups in Miami. They handed that information over to the Cuban government, who handed it over to the FBI, and the FBI turned around and built a case against them. So again, tomorrow is 16 years since their arrest. I'm going to give a little timeline just for background. That in 1998 they were arrested. For about a year and a half after that, they were held in isolation. They were charged in 2000 with a total of 26 counts, including conspiracy to commit espionage, because they didn't have any evidence of actual espionage, so they had to bring charges of thinking about espionage. And against one of them, Gerardo, charge of conspiracy to commit murder, which was related to the shooting down of a aircraft by the Cuban government in 1996. Between 2000 and 2001, they were tried in Miami, despite numerous attempts to get the trial moved out of Miami to a less hostile environment. We know already from the history in Miami how hostile it is, but we know more about how hostile it was in that moment because there's evidence that's come out about the US government actually paying journalists to create or contribute to public pressure to convict. And the result was not surprising, maybe. They were all convicted on all charges and sentenced in 2001. I'll get there in a second. They had a major legal victory in 2005 where a 3-judge panel from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta overturned all their sentences and ordered a new trial outside of Miami, somewhere else. But that was appealed by the Bush administration and reversed, and so the original verdict stood. Most recently, in terms of legal response from the US side, was in 2009 when the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. And that basically exhausted the political avenues for release of the 3 who remain. So the current legal situation of the 5: Rene survived his 13-year sentence. He was released in 2011 and he made it back to Cuba in 2013. Fernando Fernando also completed his sentence, more than 15 years in prison. He was released in February of this year and immediately returned to Cuba. And Fernando is now the vice president of the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples, which is the group that liaises with the Venceremos Brigade in Cuba, and it means that we had the privilege of meeting with Fernando several times this past July, including during work in the sugarcane fields. So, Antonio, Ramon, and Gerardo are still incarcerated. Antonio's sentence was reduced in 2009 from life to 21 years, 10 months, which means that if he completes his sentence, he'll be out in 2017. Ramon's sentence was also reduced from life, but to 30 years. He has a release date in 2024. And Gerardo's sentence was not reduced. His situation is the most dire. He's serving 2 consecutive life sentences because he was convicted of this conspiracy to commit murder charge, which came from this media pressure surrounding the trial. At this point, the only legal avenue left, there are habeas corpus appeals that have been filed over the past couple of years. They're based primarily on this evidence of U.S. government misconduct, the fact of journalists being paid before, during, after the trial to contribute to public pressure to convict. In the case of Gerardo, for example, when they were arrested, that charge of conspiracy to commit murder wasn't part of the charges. It was actually 7 months later, as it became a demand of the anti-Cuban community in Miami, that charge was added and he was convicted. So the only legal solution at this point are these habeas corpus appeals. Needless to say, it's not exactly likely that they're going to be heard. There's no time frame for that decision to be made, and there's no word on that right now. So what's maybe obvious, considering the exhaustion of all the legal measures and what's been said over and over since the beginning of this case, on all sides, by the Cubans, by the Five themselves, by supporters all over the world, is that this is a political case. It's determined by political factors. These men are political prisoners, and its solution is only going to be motivated by political calculations. One of these calculations that's kind of popular to be talked about right now has to do with a man named Alan Gross. He's a subcontractor for USAID who was arrested in 2009 in Havana, where he was distributing telecommunications equipment illegally. And he's now serving a 15-year sentence, and there's a lot of talk going on the U.S. side and on the Cuban side about the possibility of some sort of exchange. This is something that Fernando discussed with us when we met with him. It's something that he's said explicitly, a proposition that he's endorsed explicitly in public. There are reports, I don't know if they're accurate at all, that the Cuban government has made official offers to the U.S. government to make an exchange and that they've been rejected. I don't know if that's true or not. But the sentiment seemed to be in Cuba, certainly, that would be a good idea. And there are lots of elements on this side in the U.S., liberal groups, the United Nations, plenty of actors over here who are also advocating an exchange. It's worth saying, I guess, it would be this situation of Gross in Cuba and the Five here is significant in terms of anybody looking for a normalization of relations between the U.S. and Cuba. This would be a significant piece. We all know the U.S. has never had any trouble finding a pretext to justify the blockade and all their actions against Cuba, all the aggression. But Alan Gross is kind of an easy one for them to use since they like talking about human rights. Anyway. So that's basically where it stands right now. Again, it's the political nature of this case that should be highlighted and understood. Just as the conviction was motivated by political considerations, and public opinion really had a lot to do with it, public opinion that was manipulated by the media in Miami. It's the same way in terms of trying to win their release. Public opinion needs to change, and this is why Cuba, when we meet with Cubans down there, and everybody we speak to really emphasizes solidarity. For them, it's the most important side of this, and especially solidarity, of course, coming from the U.S. It's that solidarity, that demand, if it gets loud enough and strong enough and a movement is moving, that's what's going to achieve justice. I think that's what we've seen in the history of struggles to release political prisoners. The legal avenues are often not the ones that actually find a solution, but political avenues. I'm almost done here. I have a quote from Renee, who just a few days ago, actually, I believe, maybe last week, was denied a visa to enter the UK. Them doing the US government's bidding. He was going to speak on the case there, but was not allowed to enter. And he was asked by a journalist how the five have kept so firm over all these years. And he responded, "I think it's the morale. Knowing that we had morale in facing the prosecutors, morale that they will never have, gave us strength. Besides that, the justice of what we had been doing. You cannot judge anyone for protecting human life, which is the most valuable asset. And that combination of factors has given us the necessary strength and will to continue doing so, plus our formation as a result of our revolution that taught us a commitment to human dignity." So what he's talking about, this commitment to human dignity, is something I've been lucky enough to see and experience in traveling to Cuba a number of times. And with that, I invite all of you to come to Cuba with the brigade to spread the word. We want to make our group bigger, of course. The larger the group, the larger the impact in terms of changing people's minds and hopefully getting into the press and all that. I hope that I'm not being too optimistic to think that if more people in this country knew about the case of the five, they would be in favor of their release. I think that is the case. There's plenty of evidence that the facts of the case have been obscured and ignored and altered in all types of ways over the past 16 years. And I can't say that I'm expecting that to change. I'm not expecting a nice op-ed in the Times or a expose on the five on 60 Minutes. But I think that the kind of media blackout on Cuba and on the five in particular is just another piece in the blockade. It's the information blockade, and it's another piece of the blockade that the VB breaks when we travel to Cuba. So once again, yeah, come to Cuba this summer. We'll be going this summer. We'll be going every summer until the blockade and travel ban are done with, and until all five brothers are at home in Cuba. Thank you. Well, first I'll say I wasn't at the June 5 Days for the Five, unfortunately, but the people I know who went, yeah, said it was a massive success in terms of numbers, in terms of diversity of the people who came from all over the world, really. And I think it had a real impact. What's going on in Cuba right now? We had the privilege of meeting with an economist from the University of Havana who did an excellent job of laying out exactly what's going on in terms of the changes, the economic changes that are underway, and explaining the reasoning behind it, really. Explaining that that Cuba's achieved such a level of human development, of social development with their revolution, but their economy is struggling so much at this point, due largely to the blockade, but to other inefficiencies in the economy, that they're not able to sustain the level of social development with where they're at economically. And so there was something that always amazes me in Cuba, a real honesty and vulnerability about saying, we don't want to be doing this. We're not giving up. We're not turning away from socialism, as the media here likes to portray it, as all these market reforms, and Raul is less radical than Fidel, and he's taken them in another direction. There's no sense of that from the Cubans. It's very much that they're trying to do all they can to protect socialism. And that means retreating in certain areas. But I would say there's a sense of optimism, really. Especially, there's this recognition that something that they need is foreign investment. And most recently, Putin was there, the president of China was there, Russia forgave like 90% of Cuba's debt. And both Russia and China were there following, I think the BRICS conference was happening in Brazil previous to that, and they were there making deals to invest in their exploring offshore drilling, which who knows, but if they get oil, that's a big deal, of course. And supporting investment in terms of construction, housing, things like that. And there's a lot of optimism around that. That's what I can say, is that in terms of foreign investment from Russia, China, and Brazil, who they have a big deal with. Brazil is redeveloping the port of Mariel, which is going to become a major hub for trade between Latin American countries. And I'd say there's a lot of optimism around that. But it's not easy, and they'll be the first ones to admit it.